Welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. In the first verse of the hymn, there are two statements made about Christ. He is the image of the invisible God, and he is the firstborn of all creation. In the last episode, we looked at the first statement. Today, we're going to look at the second statement and dive into Christ's relationship to creation. So this was actually a pretty big issue in the early church. Colossians 1.16 was a big part of the Arian controversy. So that there's no confusion, that's A-R-I-A-N. A-R-Y-A-N is Nazis. A-R-I-A-N is the early controversy over whether Christ was a created being or not. Big difference. Basically, the issue was that a guy named Arius said that there was a time when the Son was not. In other words, there was a point in history when Christ never existed. On Arius' view, Christ may have been responsible for creating everything in existence, but he would have been created by the Father first, so he would not have existed with the Father from eternity past. This was a huge controversy in the early church, and it forced early Christians to really answer the question, who is Christ? Is he divine? Is he human? Is he both? What's going on with him? The controversy resulted in more than one church council, the Nicene Creed, and much of the language we use today to describe Christ's relationship to the Father. Now, we're not going to get into the whole debate today, but it's good reading and good theology, so take some time to learn your church history. I'll put a link to a book in the description that will help you if you want to learn more. Today, we're just going to focus on Colossians 1.15b-16 and ask whether this passage points toward Christ being part of creation or not. Let's start then with the meaning of the word firstborn. The word firstborn is often used biologically to refer to the literal firstborn human or animal, but it's not always used that way. Psalm 89:27 says, "And I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." Here you have a reference to David, but this is firstborn being used in a non-biological way. Obviously, David has already been born physically, because he's already alive at this point. Now, what you have here are two phrases put back to back. You have firstborn and the highest of the kings of the earth. Now, the phrase that's paralleled, the highest of the kings of the earth, is a further explanation on the word firstborn, at least in this psalm. And both of these refer to David's future position, not to his birth. So you have here an Old Testament example of the word firstborn referring to something other than being physically born. In this case, it's a reference to a ruling position. Now, in the New Testament, we see the word for firstborn used to refer to Christ a number of times, but there's only one that refers to physical birth without any question. That's Luke 2:7, which refers to Mary actually giving birth to Jesus. All of the other times either definitely do not refer to physical birth, or they're questionable. So just because it says firstborn in Colossians, that doesn't mean that anything is referring to Jesus' actual birth. And for the record, if the author of the hymn wanted to say that Christ was the first created being, as Arius thought, there was a way to do that. But that's not the word the author of the hymn chose to use. Anyway, the word firstborn itself could refer to physical birth, but it did not have to. It often referred to someone being in the first spot. It was a title of primacy or firstness. The way to determine which one is meant here, physical birth or firstness, is to actually look at the letter and see what it says. And importantly, there's actually one more use of the word firstborn in Colossians, and it will help us understand this one. In chapter 1, verse 18, still in the hymn, Christ is said to be the firstborn from the dead. Now, as we'll see later, though it's somewhat obvious, this refers to Christ's resurrection. And by the point that Christ died and was raised from the dead, he was already a grown man, so this cannot refer to literal birth. Do you remember the episode on structure? In that episode, we saw that the uses of firstborn in 1.15 and 1.18 are parallel, which means that they're each being used in the same way and carry the same or similar meanings. Each one helps to explain the other. So that means that if firstborn is not being used to refer to literal birth in 1.18, then it's not in 1.15 either. So Christ is the firstborn means that he is the firstborn over something, and it is not a reference to his birth. But what is he firstborn over? Well, verse 16 says he is the firstborn over creation. Now, I went over the structure of verse 16 in detail in the episode on structure, so I'm not going to repeat myself. If you want more detail on that, go back and check out the episode on structure. Here, I'm simply going to say that the author of the hymn went to great lengths to say that everything in all of creation was created by Christ. That means we have an answer for our question of whether or not Christ is part of creation or not. If Christ is responsible for everything in creation, then he is on the creator side of the creator-creation divide. And therefore, he cannot be a part of creation because one cannot bootstrap oneself into existence. By that, I mean that one cannot create oneself any more than a person can pick himself up by his own bootstraps. I mean, if you can do that, then you've basically broken physics. So I guess either a congratulations or a scolding are in order, though I'm not sure which. But as far as creation, just think about what it would take to create yourself. You would have to create yourself before you existed, but because you didn't exist, you couldn't create anything. Do you see the problem? Creating yourself simply isn't possible because to do so wouldn't break physics, it would break logic. And logic is even more foundational than physics because physics is based on logic. So both the language of the word firstborn and the content of verse 16 point towards Christ being the uncreated creator. He has always existed, and he is responsible for creation. Do you see the wisdom thought coming in here? Remember when we talked about the wisdom of God as existing in the beginning with God and being responsible for creation? Well, here you go. The hymn is saying those things about Christ. He existed in the beginning with God when there was no creation, and he is responsible for creation itself. However, what we should notice is that the same Christ the hymn says was pre-existent creator was the same Christ who was recently crucified as a criminal. The uncreated creator and the goal of all creation was crucified in Jerusalem. How to reconcile those two parts of the statement is not easy. But if those two parts can be reconciled, then the implications are not easy either. What it does not mean is that a first-century Jewish man was the creator of all things. None of the early Christian leaders would have thought of a Jewish man in sandals floating around outside of space and time creating things. No. What we have here is the beginning of incarnational thought. For centuries, Jewish theologians had been thinking about how to bridge the gap between the divine and the human. The wisdom of God, as we have talked about, was one of the ways they did this. However, the hymn goes beyond the previous thoughts on wisdom. Christ was not merely present at creation, it was made for him. Christ was the goal or purpose of creation. We see this at the end of verse 16. Now, what we see in Christ is not a human who became divine, but the divine becoming human. The hymn is saying that the powerful action of God that we see in the creation of the cosmos has stepped into creation and taken on a human form. Christ is the firstborn of all creation and the image of the invisible God. He is the one who made the whole universe and, as we'll see later in the hymn, in stepping into his creation and becoming a part of it, we have a chance to see and touch him. Literally for those who lived during his life, and through what we are told about him for everyone else. Now, we have not here gotten into the two natures in one person idea of the incarnation that will come later in church history, but this is where that comes from. Many of those ideas were formulated in response to Arius. However, those ideas were not something that were created as a result of legendary development. It's not like later Christians decided that Jesus was a god, contrary to what the early Christians thought. What we see here is a difference between talking in pictures and talking in propositions. The authors of the New Testament mostly talk in pictures, in part because many of them were Jewish. Think of how God is described in the Old Testament. God might be described as a rock, for example. Well, we all know that no one thought God was literally a rock. Rather, what someone who said something like that meant was that God was strong. He could be relied upon, and made a solid foundation, and so on and so forth. That's talking in pictures. If you're talking in propositions to describe God as strong, you would have to come up with statements like, God has the ability to be causally active in time and space in such a way that no other force, personal or impersonal, has the ability to overpower his causal actions, or something like that. It's like the difference between loving someone and trying to define what it means to love someone. How do you make a list of your actions and emotions such that you can define your feelings towards someone else? Is that even possible? Maybe, maybe not. Either way, this sort of helps get at the point that I'm trying to make. There's a difference between talking in pictures and talking in propositions. There's a difference between describing something as a poet or songwriter would and detailing it out using propositional logic as a philosopher would. What we see here in the hymn is early thoughts on the Trinity and the Incarnation. However, these thoughts are not in the philosopher's language like you will see in later centuries. Rather, they are in poetic language. They are in song form, if you will. What I think happened is that the early Christians explained things as best they could. Both who Christ is and what he did cut across so many categories that they had trouble describing what they experienced and how the world was now different. So they turned to poetic language and created pictures to help describe what they meant. In time, and as would be expected, questions arose, and so more precise definitions were needed. That's when we started seeing the philosopher's language. But the basic idea was there all along. And all of this starts with things like the hymn in Colossians, because there are very big statements made about him that cannot point in any other direction. Here, he is called the uncreated creator. The author of the hymn does it in poetic language, but that's what he's saying. Now there's a life application to be made here. Christ is called the uncreated creator, and in the description of all the things that he created, we find all of the powers and authorities in the cosmos. This could be earthly, or this could be spiritual, think angels and demons. But as we discussed when we went over this in the episode on structure, it probably means both. Now think about what Paul would say this means for your life. If Christ is over all of the other powers and authorities in the cosmos, and you follow Christ, and he takes care of you, what could you possibly have to worry about? There is no individual or group or government or anything else who can do anything to you of lasting significance. Sure, bad things might happen in the short term. But, as the end of the hymn will make clear, the end of the story has already been written. We know how things are going to turn out, and we know which side we're on. There is no one who can take that away from us, because we are taken care of by the supreme authority, the uncreated creator. There is no one who can overrule him. Therefore, we have no reason to worry. Period. Bad things happen in life, certainly. But there's no point spending all of our time trying to avoid negative things, because while some might be unpleasant, they have no lasting significance, at least when we view things from an eternal perspective. Again, we serve the one who is really in control, and the end has already been written. Now, I'm not saying that we need to be stupid and just be reckless because nothing matters. What I'm saying is that we need to keep things in perspective. We need to understand that on the scale of importance, these things are pretty far down the list. Christ is ultimately in control of everything. We serve Christ, and Christ takes care of us. The last part, Christ takes care of us, is not actually part of this verse, but you do find it elsewhere in Colossians, so the point remains. You see it in the fact that Christ works in us, the fact that we are his images and representatives, the fact that we are in his team and he is our captain, and so on and so forth. So again, we have nothing to fear because we serve the one who is in charge. Let's go back to the two statements made about Christ. He is the image of the invisible God, and he is the firstborn of all creation. What we have here are two statements that explain who Christ is. Remember, categories are being expanded and or created to explain who he is, so understanding this is important. Image shows how Christ is related to God, and firstborn shows how he is related to creation. You don't want to say that Christ actually is God the Father, so you show how he is related to the Father. He is the image of the invisible God. But you also want to show how he is divine. Think Trinitarian thought in poetic language. So the hymn says some things about him that are reserved for God. Christ created all things. Christ is himself uncreated. creation was made for Christ. So, in these two statements, you have a basic explanation about who Christ is. In the second main verse of the hymn, we will get into what Christ has done. But before we get there, we need to take a brief look at the transitional verse in between the two main ones. And that will be the subject of the next episode.